neighborhood. On sanctions, Hillary and I have just returned from our most recent visit to Iran last month. We're happy to talk more about current economic conditions, social and political conditions in the Q&A. For now, let me say simply that no one who has walked the streets of Tehran, who has seen that Iran's economy is not collapsing, or who's talked to a range of Iranians, could possibly think that sanctions are working in a way that will compel either the Islamic Republic's implosion or its surrender to American demands on the nuclear issue. That is delusional. On the Arab awakening, the same pundits who say that sanctions are working advise you to embrace the logic-defying proposition that the same social currents that deposed pro-American leaders in Tunisia and Egypt and are empowering Islamists in countries across the Arab world will, in Iran, somehow transform the Islamic Republic into a secular liberal state. That is truly logic-defying. In Tehran, we can tell you, Iranian policymakers and analysts see the Arab awakening as hugely positive for the Islamic Republic's regional position. They judge correctly that any Arab government which becomes at all more representative of its people's beliefs, concerns, etc., will also become less enthusiastic about strategic cooperation with the United States, let alone Israel, and more open to Tehran's message of foreign policy independence. Tehran doesn't need Arab governments to be more pro-Iranian. It just needs them to be less pro-American, less pro-Israel, and more independent. More particularly, one hears in Washington that because of the Arab awakening, Tehran is going to lose Syria, its quote-unquote only Arab ally, with dire consequences for the Islamic Republic's regional position or even its internal stability. I'll make 2 points on this. First, Syria isn't Iran's only Arab ally today. Syria isn't even Iran's most important Arab ally today. Thanks to President George W. Bush and all those Democrats who supported him after 9/11, the Islamic Republic's most important ally today isn't Syria, it's Iraq. Second point, Iranian policymakers don't believe that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad will be overthrown, at least not by Syrians. Assad still retains the support of about half of Syrian society. Even if Assad felt compelled at some point to surrender Damascus, he and his forces would continue to control a significant part of Syrian territory. Under these circumstances, Syria is hardly likely to become an ally of the West. Indeed, any sort of plausibly representative post-Assad government isn't going to be more pro-American or pro-Israel than the Assads have been. Such a government might even be less keen about keeping Syria's border with Israel quiet, and that will be just fine for the Islamic Republic. Iranian officials believe that overall developments in the Middle East are continuing to steer the regional balance in Tehran's favor. As far as the prospects for U.S.-Iranian diplomacy are concerned, Hillary and I think that one of the most dangerous myths promoted by some of America's so-called Iran experts is that the Islamic Republic is so ideologically committed to anti-Americanism, or at least so dependent on anti-Americanism for its domestic legitimacy, that it can't ever seriously contemplate improving relations with the United States. This is thoroughly contradicted by the historical record. As we show in our book, the Islamic Republic has been prepared for decades for better relations with the United States. We're happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But in the Iranian view, this is only possible on a basis of equality and mutual respect, meaning that the United States needs to accept the Islamic Republic. It's the United States that hasn't been willing to deal on this basis. Even under President Obama, his administration has participated in multilateral nuclear negotiations with Iran and used Iran's unwillingness to surrender to U.S. demands in these talks to intensify sanctions, step up covert action, launch cyber war, against the Islamic Republic and come ever closer to regime change as the ultimate goal of American policy. While U.S. officials regularly excoriate Tehran for either playing for time or being too internally conflicted to negotiate seriously, it is Washington that has not been diplomatically serious. Iran has consistently been prepared to accept more intrusive monitoring of, perhaps negotiated limits on, its nuclear activities if Western powers recognized its right to enrich uranium under international safeguards. But President Obama, like his predecessor, refuses to acknowledge Iran's right to enrich. For this would require acknowledging the Islamic Republic as a legitimate political order representing legitimate national interests and as a rising regional power unwilling to subordinate its foreign policy to Washington, as, for example, Washington regularly expected of Egypt under Sadat and Mubarak. This is why Hillary and I say that Obama has done more damage even than George W. Bush, because he has discredited the idea of engagement by saying he tried but failed, when in fact he has not seriously tried.
We're going to have time for questions.
Yeah, that's fine. No American president since the Iranian Revolution has been prepared to do this, to accept the Islamic Republic. But, and this is a key argument for us, this is the only way diplomacy can succeed. There is an important precedent for this in modern American history. It's appropriate to call this in the month in which Richard Nixon's 100th birthday falls. Nixon and Kissinger's opening to China. Their great achievement was not that they talked to Beijing. The United States had been talking to Beijing for years in ambassadorial level talks that had gone nowhere. Nixon and Kissinger's achievement was that they accepted and persuaded their countrymen to accept the People's Republic of China as a legitimate political order representing legitimate national interests that the United States, for its own interests, needed to come to terms with. That's what we need to do with the Islamic Republic today. Is Obama going to be up to this in his second term? Thank you very much.
We've got about 20 minutes left. I just wanted to ask one question. As I read through your book, Iran, one of the quotes you have in there, Iran has never attacked another state or even threatened to attack one. I've got a little bit of experience. I was at West Point on the 21st of January in 1981 when we had dinner with the hostages as they came back, and I think there would be some argument along that regard. I spent 2 years in Afghanistan, and in several of the operations we did, we uncovered caches and weapons that were marked with Iranian markings, and our assessment was that they had come from Iran. If you look at the 2006 Israeli fight in Lebanon, I think you would have some discussions there about Iranian involvement in that operation. So I hear you that they have not invaded another country, but clearly supporting in other ways, I think is something that in my short experience I've seen. So I wonder how would you respond to those activities?
I'll go first. I think they're all very important points, and particularly this is something I think that drives the American perception of the Islamic Republic, that is an aggressive state, particularly with the rhetoric or how some of the rhetoric is translated or construed here, that the Islamic Republic is aggressive, and particularly aggressive vis-a-vis the state of Israel. You constantly hear that the Islamic Republic of Iran is threatened to annihilate Israel, to wipe it off the map. Clearly, the Islamic Republic of Iran has a bad relationship with Israel. It doesn't accept it. It doesn't accept its way of its political order in terms of how it disenfranchises a large segment of its population, and it is opposed to that. The Islamic Republic also has views in terms of of its neighbors and how their orders are that are hostile to Iran. It sees a lot of these political orders as hostile to it. But what we're trying to get across is what Iran does to respond to what it sees as these threats is not to threaten to attack, is not to threaten to invade, and is not to attack or invade. The Islamic Republic has never attacked or invaded any other country. That's not what it does. What it does is something even more powerful, something maybe even more potent vis-a-vis the United States that we can't really compete with as we stay a conventional military power, which is, first and foremost, it develops relationships with groups on the ground. Those relationships have much to do with, and we argue mostly to do with, its soft power appeal. Its appeal in terms of Islamist, participatory Islamist governance, its independent foreign policy, and its resistance to occupation. Whether that occupation is Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, or whether that occupation is the U.S. occupation in Afghanistan, essentially, or as it was in Iraq. It does that very, very effectively. But Iran, like other states, Iran under the Shah, other states, also buttresses those relationships with support, whether that's financial support or guns and things like that. But what we are trying to get across is, by focusing on that piece, that is a very small piece, and that's not the problem. We can outgun Iran anytime. The U.S. military can project overwhelming conventional military force and crush Iran militarily in any arena. That's not the problem we have with Iran. The problem we have with Iran is their ability to form these deep relationships with groups across the region, from Afghanistan to Egypt. That's what we don't have an answer to. That's what we're saying is dramatically shifting the balance of power. If it were all about who has the most guns, we would be in the great situation that we were in the 1980s and 1990s, where Iran didn't stand a chance. The Islamic Republic had no way to oppose us in the Middle East. But what they've done is they've seized on this political awakening in the Middle East, and they are changing the balance of power in a way that we have no answer to.
Yeah. Please identify yourself.
I'm Gloria Tibbs, and I've been in the UN since 1957. I would like to point out, you said some very important things, but what we have lost with Iran is trust. When we did not allow the Shah of Iran to come into the United States to die, we ended a relationship since we started the United States. Iran goes back 2,500 years. Let's realize in the temples, every temple has the everlasting light to King Darius. Now suddenly you have this hate between the Jewish religion, not just Israeli, it's the Jewish population worldwide. I believe what you've said, you put a very big key on this. I'm admiring everything you've said. But I believe one of the worst is the loss of the trust. Put yourself, any one of us today, would we trust America if we were a head of state of Iran, what they did to the Shah of Iran? This is what's frightening. That could ever be repaired. It's fragile, in my opinion, and very key. I know Iran. I know the old royal family. I traveled with the Empress. I believe everything you've said is right. I have one other quick question because I don't want to disturb you. What about Egypt today, the Islamic Republic? What will happen there? Because nobody really knows, but that's very key. Whispers are they're going to give relations to Israel, under the table relations. I hope I'm right with my information. What is your opinion?
Trust is a very difficult issue. And we argue in the book that the one known antidote to trust is transparency. And I think for many Americans, this issue comes squarely focused on the nuclear issue today. That with this lack of trust, we can't possibly trust whatever the Iranians may or may not say or may not do with the IAEA, the International Monitoring Mechanism, to look at Iran's nuclear program. For many Americans, they're never going to trust the Islamic Republic, and for many Iranians, they're never going to trust the United States. But the key is transparency. And here, what we focus on is, if there is a better relationship between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States, if there is a real rapprochement, a real strategic alignment, then we argue the Islamic Republic of Iran